Great. Well, thank you very much. And boy, today has been a little rushed. I just basically had to reconfigure my audio setup. So thank you all for making it. A bit buzzy. Buzz is gone. Okay. Let me know. I am working towards that. Let's see. So, yep, today's talk is making dollars and cents of free software funding's future. Do I best control this? Is slide switch? No? I'm not seeing the news. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's just taking a minute to load. All right. So, who am I? Why am I here talking to you? Well, first of all, I'm Salt, and I'm here because I believe in a big and little f free society, people, planet, future, world, culture. It's kind of one of the things that's been driving my interest for a long time. And you can find me at AltSalt pretty much everywhere, .net, in different places. I've been using Linux since 1996 and speaking and organizing groups and conferences and whatnot since about 2005. But recently, I've been spending my time kind of in a few core areas. So the first one is academia. I recently got my master's thesis submitted and defended just over a month ago. And I've been spending a lot of kind of energy and time doing that for the last 4 years. Right now I'm in a PhD program to continue with that. Thank you very much. And my focus has really been on tech policy and then peer production communities, policies, and whatnot around all of that area. So kind of our space. My second area has been events. And specifically, for the last 8 years, I've been involved with SeaGL, the Seattle GNU Linux Conference. You can see a little SeaGL here, a little SeaGL there, SeaGL everywhere. Our ninth event is 9th year is coming up, and we have announced that we're going to be virtual. So please check us out. CFP will be out sometime next month, but that'll be November 5th and 6th. And the last one is crowd matching. So this is kind of an area I've been involved in for over 5 years now, and part of what I'm going to be discussing today. So I'm technically the community director of Snowdrift.coop, and we've been a OSI incubator project now, and we're about to graduate and move on to actually being launched and making some of this stuff a reality. That said, we're also waiting to hear back from the FSF High Priorities Project Committee. And we've applied, and we actually wrote out, I think, quite a good thing. So if you have some time to read that blog post, I'd recommend it. That's me. What are we here for? What is today? So looking at the really high level, I'm going to talk to you about a wicked problem. And the wicked problem is that everything comes down to coordination. It's kind of the defining characteristic of Homo sapiens. This ability to coordinate, to have shared systems of understanding. They enable us to have a society. They let us build these amazing things. But sometimes these things are harmful. Sometimes they're great. Currently, knowledge commons exists in this attention economy. And that introduces surveillance and advertising, which is a whole bunch of not so nice things. But what alternatives do we have? And what would a world look like if we were just free to create? Well, what we're going to be talking about here over the next 30 minutes or so is we're going to go through the definitions so that we're kind of on the same page about things. I'm going to give you a brief history of public goods funding, talk about kind of the current state of funding, how we are funding this stuff, and then some of the solutions that are actively being worked on. So these are the one thing is kind of our project, but there are others. And then the future, as I see it, the future that kind of hoping to build with all of you. So starting with the definitions. Now, there's a lot of terms that we could go over. I'm gonna not try to belabor some of them. If you want to go deeper, I'm happy to have those conversations elsewhere. But there are a few that are kind of valuable for moving the conversation forward. So the ones that I want you to keep in mind as I go through these are the public goods, the commons, free, libre, open source software, tragedy of the commons, and free writing. Make sure that I do not disturb my computer's up. Okay, so let's start with what are the public goods? What is the commons? Now, public goods as a term is a concept from economics. It was attributed to Paul Samuelson in 1954, and then expanded by Richard Musgrave and Garrett Hardin in the 60s. Its current form, as we understand it, was kind of put forth by Elinor Ostrom in 1990. Now, what you see on the screen here is the Ostrom 2x2 matrix. It's displaying 4 types of goods, and they're differentiated by these kind of 2 characteristics. So the first one is rivalry. This is whether something's usefulness is diminished through usage. And the second one is excludability. That's whether the use can be restricted. Can you exclude people from it? Now, examples of each of these 4. The one I like to say for a private good is like a piece of clothing, like a hat. If I'm wearing the hat, you can't also be wearing that same hat. A club good is, again, somewhere where you put a wall around it. So usually you might think of an amusement park, right? I mean, private club good. Then there's common pool resources. Now, common pool resources are these areas where there is rivalrousness. There's a limited amount of resources, but it's not excluded. It's not excludable. It's commonly accessible. So an idea here might be an ocean full of fish. Now, ocean full of fish, everyone has the fish, but you can imagine that there are a limited number of fish, and so it is a common pool of resources. The last one, and the one we're going to talk about a lot here, are public goods. Now, public goods can be thought of as things that everyone can share, and sharing is not diminishing it for anyone else. The one that I like to talk about, but it's only my hope that it will continue to be a public good, is clean air, right? This idea of like, I'm breathing air, you're breathing air, that's not, in a broad sense, diminishing the air quality. All right, so that framing of economic terms kind of gets us to what the public goods are. It explains a little bit about the commons. We'll come back to that shortly. The next big area, and I know this is going to be common to most of you, but is free, libre, open source software. Now, in the 1980s, Richard Stallman, RMS, came up with this idea to turn copyright back on itself, and what we commonly refer to as copyleft. And the idea behind that is to really turn things that are otherwise being licensed and restricted into public goods. Now, it's been extended outside the scope of software, things like Creative Commons, and it's also been misappropriated, right? This open source washing. And despite the arguments over the years, I just go with flow, right? I'm going to go with the flow. Free, libre, open. I actually think each one brings something different and valuable to the conversation. But just to be clear, we are talking about the free software movement, and specifically, when things are flow licensed, they become public goods. Again, not to get into the difference between the terms all that much here, but that is actually part of what my thesis is about, and breaking down this idea of permissive and protective, because the copyleft stuff keeps things public goods, whereas the permissive licenses only make the initial instance a public good. But there's two kind of related, like deeply related items when we talk about free libre open source software, FLOSS, and I guess public goods in general, but public goods and the commons in general. So the first one's called the tragedy of the commons. And this is actually related to that older term, like I mentioned, we'd go back to it, of the commons. This talk I gave earlier this year at Libre Planet, and I was a little bit retired. I was just going through things, and someone actually pointed out that I kind of conflated the history of the commons and the public goods and all of that. So I'm trying to make that a little more clear. The history of the commons extends back to at least the 1550s in Great Britain, likely before then. But the tragedy of the commons was first written about by William Forster Lloyd in 1833 and brought into modern attention, as well as actually being named Tragedy of the Commons, by Garrett Hardin in 1968. The idea behind this is commons will collapse if they're overused, right? And not only that, that a lot of game theory basically shows it's in everyone's, maybe not best interest, but it's natural to overuse these resources. Now, Ostrom demonstrated that it's avoidable through proper governance. Actually, yeah, how quickly can I pull out the Ostrom book, Governing the Commons? So that's the tragedy of the commons, and we kind of know about it, and we'll get back to why we're defining these terms fairly shortly. The other big problem that's often discussed is the free rider problem. Now, what this is that through the widespread use of public goods, without providing support back, we get degradation. We have excess pressure on those people who do support the public goods, right? If everyone rides the bus for free, who pays for the maintenance, right? And of course, buses aren't maybe always the best, example, but transit as a broader system. Now, this talk is mostly going to focus on public goods and the free rider problem. And when I think of public goods, what I really think of is public information goods. That's because it, as I've come up a few times here, thinking about what a public good is can be tricky when you're talking about tangible things. They often talk about national security or the radio wave spectrum. It takes a lot of work to get that abstract concept. But if you think of it as information can be shared without it costing barely anything. It does cost some time, some electricity. There are things like that, but the costs start going away. They become minimal. And by having the costs go away, it can be a lot easier to conceptualize these things as true public goods, as long as they're staying not excludable. Now, what I think of when I think information goods, I think of software, as we've discussed, and I think of research. I think of journalism, and to some extent, I think of art, though not all forms of art, but many. So now that we have the definitions down, I want to start talking about the history. And this is so that we can kind of discuss the context with which this conversation is taking place. And I'm going to be approaching this from discussion of journalism, funding of journalism, which is going through patronage to the people, to some extent back to patronage, before we talk about that model in terms of software and a broader software ecosystem. So, journalism. Oh, sorry about that. Moving through my slides a little more quickly. Journalism was initially funded by those who could afford printing presses. Right? These things are by no means cheap. There were few of them. And if you wanted to print something, you had to go to the person with the printing press. They made those decisions. Right? Yes, there are legal frameworks that were brought up to even restrict it more. But when it came down to it, that's what happened. But as time went on, the printing presses became more affordable, became more democratized, some might say. And the funding structure behind journalism switched to really relying on classifieds and like advertisements. Rolling back a little bit, I'm talking mostly about journalism in the context of the United States, as I'll touch on momentarily. As the classified ads became free online, right, as we had Craigslist and other things, the power was really placed more and more and more with just the advertisers, to the point where they drive the message. This gets back to that idea of the attention economy. The idea that if you want money, if you want to pay your journalists, you have to run things that the advertisers will give you money for. So that means that you're running things that are more shocking, things that are maybe not as useful in the traditional journalistic form. Now, some countries, why I was speaking about the US here, have actually a different model. They state sponsor their journalism. They state sponsor their news. Now, one that comes to my mind often is France. And this type of sponsorship, this type of funding, has problems, right? There are things you can't say if you want to keep your funding. But it does allow the news to be more focused on the civic issues, on things of the public interest. Because the news isn't being directed, it does have corners where they don't want you to maybe look, but and not that you can't, but like if you want to keep your funding and that type of thing, but it's not being directed in that same sense. And so if we think about that model where it was like very directed and then kind of went to the people and is now moved back to being directed versus it was very directed and instead of moving kind of to the people, it moved to what we may think of as a larger sense of people, the government. And so it doesn't have that direction, but it also is being funded by this large entity still. So that arc, I see it in other public goods. And specifically, part of why we're here is I see it in software. Now, initially, software, before we even conceptualized it all that different as from hardware, it was funded by universities, right? The idea that graduate students were working on these things in the military industrial complex. But then it was freed to what you might think of like the public, though of course most people didn't have access to computers or the available knowledge to interact with it. But it was freed, and these public goods were, you might say, funded through development effort, right? There's still the energy and effort going into them, but it's hobbyists were able to interact with them. Now, as an ecosystem, FLOSS communities, they have to keep the lights on, right? have to eat, pay rent, have servers. And so the developers ended up getting hired on by companies more and more. And that means their efforts do become directed, right? They get directed away from flow projects because they have to sign CLAs, CAAs. They have to work on the majority of the time on this project versus the project they may want to work on. This kind of brings me to this term that one of my favorite old papers. It's called cooking pot markets. And it was described by, sorry if I'm butchering the name, but Rashad Ghosh in 1998. And the idea is that the cooking pot is full of public goods. And so when you add more of these goods, because they're public goods, everyone can take out without the pot diminishing. So it just grows, gets better and bigger and richer. But what's stopping FLOSS from growing? Like we have absolutely grown. We do see all of these areas where we have operating systems. We have BIOS. We have these great graphics programs, and there's some places we're absolutely doing well. But in general, right, we're not growing to this true point of being able to be competitive, at least in my opinion. Unfortunately, I want that. Now, what I think the reason is that the ecosystem of software, of free software, is actually not public goods. It's a commons. And so we need to sustain that ecosystem as we would with a commons. We need to sustain the developers, not just keep putting in public good code. If you don't sustain the developers, you see these vulnerabilities, right? You see Heartbleed, the lack of the getting new developers, spending the time, spending the money, and that path towards competing, like truly being competitive with proprietary software, just I don't think that it is going to happen unless we start worrying about this being a commons. Developers are humans, and in our current system, humans need funding. And of course, we do live in a society where there's funding. It exists. We're here, right? We're here at this amazing event. And part of that is that there are people already shoveling, in the sense that we'll get to. There are people who are already engaging, giving of themselves, right? We've gotten here. But really, the funding comes from two kind of large spaces. I should say three, but for what I would consider like good funding, we have individual funding and we have institutional funding. And then we have the thing I would like to avoid more, and we'll get to, which is manipulative funding. So, yes. All right. Questions? I don't see the shared notes because that will take me out of the presentation mode, but I will take a look at those after I'm done, or if you drop them in the chat. So let's talk about individual funding. The first one is through donations. I mean, this is the traditional funding source everyone has and thinks about, you know, can you please make a donation? But these are often one time, right? And they're boundless. There's no floor, there's no ceiling. You can give as little or as much. And that doesn't really connect with the project needs, right? If the project needs $1,000 to hire an ad agency to be able to produce something, they can't get it through like asking, this is how much we need. And there's not really this guarantee of impact. There's nothing that says that if I give my $5, that's going to sustain the project. Even if I give my $5 a month, it's not going to sustain the project necessarily, unless, as we get to, wealthy enough to really be getting load. Their big space in individual funding is newer, but it's become very popular. and that's crowdfunding. Now, crowdfunding is kind of in two camps. We have the all or nothing one-time crowdfund. So this is Kickstarter. These are producing something, everyone working towards a goal, getting to the goal, and making it happen. That's great. It's good. It is going well. We've seen a lot come out of this. The other camp is these ongoing pledges. But the ongoing pledges are made with a variety of levels. They're made with, I'm going to give more than you, and so I get earlier access, right? I get the little extra trinket. And so that's of course, like the Patreon model. But both of these lose their effectiveness when it comes to public goods, because you can't exclude people, right? And they're not rivalrous. Rivalrous doesn't necessarily matter as much with these, but the excludability definitely does. Because both of these, you're giving at the different levels because you're getting something more than other people. It's not based on because you have more necessarily. Now, the other two in this individual funding space have my Tux tea for my Teagle, Tux tea mug. We have pledge drives. Now, pledge drives are kind of crowdfunding, but they're older, more traditional, and they're really effective, especially because they don't have those thresholds, but they still are like kind of a time-bound thing. But they require wide-reaching communication, right? I'm sure many of you have listened to NPR, and that annual pledge drive comes around. You've been on Wikipedia and you've seen the drives. They need to hit a lot of people to raise the amounts that they're looking for. And they also are really maximized when there's this matching, this idea that someone's very wealthy and I'm going to match however many people up to this point. And so that really attracts people because they know that it's not just their money, it's their money and others. And so it grows faster, and they're willing to make those little gives because, again, with that wide communication network, they really can kind of have some assurance that they're making a difference. And the last one's a little different than all of those other categories, and this is bounties and commissions. This is the idea that I'm only going to make progress if the price gets paid, right? Which restricts creativity because now I can only work on the things that are being paid for. And there's this potential for sabotage. As sad as it is, I can make things that people will want to pay for so that they will then pay the bounty, and I'll work on that. It just hasn't seen that much success in the broader sense. Now, I was moving to institutional funding. With institutional funding, we have three big broad spaces. We have grants, which are people and organizations that have all this money, and they are trying to support the social good and or avoid taxes. That usually comes with restrictive terms. You can only spend that money on certain things, and often it's these large funds, which a project that has been getting like $5 here and there suddenly gets $10,000. What do they even do with it? What happens when that $10,000 goes away and they've hired people, right? Do they then have to work more on these grants? There's sponsorships, often with direct strings and again, limitations. Sometimes this is indirect. This is the idea that you have 20% of your time to work on something free, or that you just have a job so that you can fund your side project working on these things. And those provide these subtle influences, sometimes through advertising. The last one, the biggest one, the one that's like the greatest source of public goods funding right now is taxes. This has all of the political arguments we could make about bureaucracies, and really a lot of it comes down to poor distribution. doesn't go to the projects that are needed, which leads to underfunding. So the last one, just touch on here, is malicious. This is what I really get to when we talk about this big divide, right? This is the idea of providing something for free of charge in exchange for making you the product, right? And they do that through manipulation and surveillance. The game can have control over the consumer. So what's being worked on right now, right? Wearing the Snowdrift shirt, pointing to the Snowdrift picture, clearly involved with Snowdrift. Well, there's a number of things. First one I want to talk about is Tidelift. They're pretty cool. They're approaching this challenge of how do you give money and support and fund those libraries like SSL? How do you fund the stuff that no one sees? And they do it through basically maintaining updates and charging the big companies and projects that are using those libraries, and then passing that out and distributing it. There's GitHub sponsors. It's been discussed somewhat more, but it's great. It's great that you can get so many people, so many eyes on these projects, because GitHub is this huge software forge. But because it's such a huge software forge, well, it doesn't necessarily give money to, again, where it's needed, and maybe it disperses it too much, and it still has a lot of these problems where there's still donations, right? Still going into some of these current models. And then there's Snowdrift. And I'll talk about Snowdrift real briefly here, but then there's also tons more. We've compiled, well, I think compiled all the research, but we've done research on over 700 of these public goods funding sites, and it's on our wiki, and we've compiled hundreds of them, actually showing it because they were the more popular, more interesting ones. Now, Snowdrift.coop, crowd matching for public goods. Now, Snowdrift is, I've been working on this thing called crowd matching. The idea of crowd matching addresses some of these questions and points. So each month, you donate, you pledge. The amount you donate is really small, like 1/10 of a penny small. But it's that number times the number of other people who make that same pledge. And so what happens is that as more patrons join, you end up giving a little more. And not only do you give a little more, but everyone else gives a little more. Because it gets back to that idea of you're all trying to support the project. You're all there coordinating to really push something forward, to make something sustainable. And mathematically, it's interesting in that the current idea behind this has a linear growth in the amount you give, but a quadratic growth in the amount that the project receives. So we're different, as you'd expect. That's part of why I'm here, part of this community, part of why I'm interested in this project. We're different because mutual assurance, that's the big thing, the coordination problem. That's what we're hitting. And it's ongoing. It is a subscription type model because it's sustainability is what we care about, right? We don't just want to launch the project. We want them to actually run. We want them to be able to hire full-time developers, full-time designers. We only work for public goods. Sure, the model could be and is, to some extent, our places are trying to work on it, but really this is for public goods. It's addressing a problem that doesn't have a good solution. And I should say, we are definitely addressing the projects that are more end user focused, projects that are things people see and touch and use, not necessarily all public goods. Right now, we've talked a lot about this being more software driven, but we definitely want to support journalism, research, art. But really, it makes sense for public goods because of all of the things we discussed about what makes public goods public goods. We don't take any fees. we are like a free libre open source software project. We're a public good, and we expect to use our own platform to fund ourselves, which of course puts us as a nonprofit, and we have been cooperatively operated, and in the future, this is the area we work in and care about. So I'll make the call for help. We need it. We've been around for a long time, and we're still not launched. We have a ton of technical work. We have a ton of knowledge work we've done. But we don't have quite enough to get there because we're all volunteers right now, right? We haven't gone out and gotten those grants. We haven't gone into these systems of funding. So if you're a developer, or if you know developers who are interested, front-end dev, CSS, we're using Elm and Haskell, and happy to talk about that more later. And that's our back end as well. Organizational, it costs money to write terms of service. You can copy boilerplate all you want, but we actually care, and we want them to be understood and reasonable for people. Could use program managers, bunch of volunteer cats. And of course, getting all of this cooperative stuff structured is always valuable. Community, I'm the community director by title, but we all wear a lot of hats right now. But it's writing, outreach, moderation of the different communication platforms and channels. And so we have a how to help page. It's a little bit crusty, but check it out. And here's some of those platforms, right? We have the forum, we have IRC and Matrix, email, Mastodon, Twitter. Probably end up in other places if we have more help. So I do appreciate anyone who can help out. I'm gonna almost end here. Basically talk about what is the future. Right? We've talked about these being wicked problems. Wicked problems mean that one approach won't suffice to fix them. It means that all of these projects need help. And there's been some policy pushes, more so in Europe, but I'm really excited about them. It's these ideas that anything that's tax funded should be flow. The public should own any public goods that were created using public funds. I mean, that just makes sense to me. Beyond platforms and projects that are trying to fund public goods and enable this funding, time is one of the most invaluable resources, right? Valuable and invaluable. People are willingly giving theirs today, right? They're shoveling that snow. And I didn't really touch on the game theory problem about our name. I'm short on time, so I won't right now. But my interest and why I've transitioned kind of from a practitioner to a researcher, it stems from this vision. This vision of what if we're, instead of talking about 8%, 10%, 12% unemployment, we were considering 60%, 70%, 80%. Now, COVID-19 pandemic, it has been a struggle. We're at this virtual conference. And of those struggles, unprecedented, as I'm sure we're all used to hearing by now, that word, levels of unemployment. And the economy has not yet totally collapsed. Hopefully won't. It's pretty interesting. I'm interested in what would it look like if we didn't force people back to work. Would they create public goods? Would they give more of that time and move us towards a big N little f free world? Could this lead to the free software movement utopia that was discussed by Stefan Martin in 20 years ago in Milestones on the Way to the GPL Society? I don't know. I don't know if the future is going to be UBI, UBS, blockchain economy. I'm not sure. But I do know that I want to believe that we'll be in a more free, libre, open space than today. And finally, just to close, Snowdrift has been active for many years. Despite not launching, we've been deeply engaged with these conversations and topics, producing hundreds of pages on our wiki and elsewhere. And recently, we've had this discussion surfacing about our own missions and goals. And no decisions have been made, but I'm pretty excited for this potential where we consider crowd batching just one of many projects and experiments that we think through, that we release in a just kind of setting, some sort of a group that's thinking deeply about the future of sustainable public goods. With that, so thank you very much for all of your time. Really appreciate it. And I do want to shout out to Slide Carnival, and one of my students introduced me to this. It's pretty neat. Everything was released CC BY, and they don't say that. They say, you know, it's free to use, public, private, commercial. I went and hunted out, it's CC BY. It's great. It's great that my students are using CC BY public flow license stuff. Again, SeaGL, November 5th and 6th, virtual. And please feel free to ask about that. And yeah, I think we have maybe a few minutes for questions here. I'm at altsalt.net, Salt on a lot of IRC matrix places, and of course using CC BY SA. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to click on the shared notes and see if it breaks everything.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have 2 questions for you at the shared notes.
All right. So the first question here is on yesterday's talk about Krita's funding. Halla said that she's not so interested in focusing on features requested by companies because most don't support the project, whereas individual users are more likely to support. So what are some funding options where more people who are making use of the software get to support the software? And that's definitely, Snowdrift that's exactly what we're looking at. There are a lot of other ones, and if you go to our wiki and look at, I think it's called the market research section, it talks about other crowdfunding projects. And there are some that are currently active and working. I don't want to just name them because, again, we looked at like over 700. And we've explored why some are better or worse than others. The hope is that Snowdrift will be the one that I can point you to in the very near future. And the second question here is what do you think of Blender's funding model? I am not immediately aware of Blender's funding model. If someone wants to put that either in the notes or chat, because I want to research it right here, but I know that at least in part, Blender's been super, super successful in, I think they were like maybe the initial crowdfunded project, like on the internet. They've been super successful in being one of the more industry like winners. And so I assume that part of that funding comes from the education around Blender and the commercial use around Blender and things like that. And that's really great for something that's achieved that scale and that competitive position. But that's not the kind of projects as a whole. This is the chat here. Let's see. And what open prioritization? I am not sure what this one is. Let's see. If I click on this one, break everything. I always worry a little bit about it breaking everything. I hit a 404. That's because of the markdown. I have this issue with other sites. Experimenting crowdfunding to prioritize new features, implementations for browsers. So it sounds like a bounty type of system. I'll have to look into it further. I don't think it's on our page yet, but it will be now. And again, I think with that, we're at the end of the time. So thank you so much for having me. I hope to see you in the future. And thank you very much.